Hello, bonjour, Tansi, bonjour, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. My name is Sandra Bender, and I am the Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the NCTR. Before I turn it over to our honored speakers today, I'm just going to share some quick housekeeping notes. First, there will be simultaneous translation into ASL here on the English channel throughout the conversation. Il y aura aussi une traduction simultanée en français sous le bouton appelé Interprétation. Vous pouvez trouver ce bouton sous le globe ou peut-être dedans les trois points appelés More. Pour le français, s'il vous plaît, changez la chaîne maintenant. So this is a webinar setup, which means that cameras, microphones, and the chat function are not enabled. You may, however, use the Q&A function to submit questions, and our speakers will leave about 10 minutes to address some of them toward the end. There are a great number of people here with us today, which is fantastic, but it means that only a few questions will actually be able to get answered. If your question is not answered and you're burning to have an answer, you can always submit it back through the email that sent you the link to this Zoom webinar, and we will do our best to get you an answer. We do expect that all answers will be asked with respect. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is located in Treaty 1 territory, which is the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe, Inninewak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Dene, and the Red River Métis. We are located in a province that sources power from dams on the mighty river systems of the North in Treaty 5 and drink water that comes from Treaty 3. For all of us joining across Turtle Island, I invite you to take a silent moment to consider the First Peoples whose lands these have always been and always will be, with or without regard for treaty. As we enter today's discussion, I invite you to open your minds, hearts, and spirits that we may speak truth, hear truth, and move forward together in better paths. It is now my honor to introduce today's speakers and moderator. We have with us today Dr. Janice Forsyth, Dr. Antoine Mountain, and moderator Dr. Vanessa Watts. So I will leave it to the three of you to speak about yourselves. Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Niawa miigwech so much for the introduction and to the NCTR for hosting this. And to all of you for joining in today. I feel so pleased and privileged to be in conversation with Dr. Antoine Mountain and Dr. Janice Forsyth. We're going to be talking about sports and rec today and residential schools as well as the TRC. Just to let folks know, I'm coming to you from Six Nations of the Grand River. I am Mohawk and Anishinaabe, and I work at McMaster. So maybe we will open it up with a question, and before either of you answer, please feel free to introduce yourselves as well before getting into the question. But for our audience today, I mean, I think many of us think of sport as a form of recreation. And today we're thinking about it especially in the context of the residential school experience. So do you have thoughts or reflections about possible tensions that this brings or even opportunities from your own experience? And I'll pass it over to Dr. Mountain first.
Thank you for having me here. My name is Antoine Mountain. I am Dene, from Dene Nation, on the map being Northwest Territories. My home is 600 miles north of Yellowknife, and I worked on my dissertation for a PhD with the Elders Council at home, and a few years ago, while I was still finishing up on it, I was talking with one of the elders, another residential school survivor that lives in one of the communities that the residential schools was at the time. And she says, I know that you're working with the Elders Council, and so I'm always there when they're talking about this and that, since I'm an elder myself. And she said, what they're saying right now is Antoine Mountain cannot be a doctor because we never see him at the medical center. I guess it's a way for our people to keep you humble, and but it had to do with the the way our people had respect for each other in order to um, inter, well, not at the time, bodies were put on a stage at the time, but basically getting at how the community kept itself together and involved the youth. What would happen is if somebody passed away, then the matriarch of the clan would pick out able-bodied teenagers, ones that had already proven themselves by spending an entire year, an entire winter out on the land by themselves. They proved that they could do something like that, so they were qualified to work as pallbearers and also to work on the month-long ceremonial that we call Itzichi. It simply means something that is very difficult to do. So when they were picked, they actually stepped into a different kind of a world altogether with spiritual powers. So people were also afraid of them, even though their job was to keep the spirits of the people up. And so they would help out each of the households with wood, hauling water, and ice for tea, those kind of things. And what makes it especially relevant today is that they were related to each other for life. And they were also related to the grieving family for life. And in a very real way, this is what we are missing today, that sense of community that we even had for a short term with the COVID and all that. People were drawn more closer together, and even wildlife was being seen at places they had never been for quite a while. And in a way, it's that kind of intergenerational relationship that has kind of slipped in a way that's created the trauma that we are dealing with today. Uh, so I don't want to get into too many details about it, but just to, since you mentioned the sports this year, I don't know if anyone has seen those before. It's very rare. It's called the Tom Longboat Award. It's given to the top First Nations Athlete of the Year in Canada. I won it in 1968, and they're still waiting for some of the others to cross the finish line. So a lot of competition. So I'll just leave that for now, and we'll go on with our program here. Masi Miigwech.
Thank you, Antoine. Very exciting to see the Tom Longboat medal. I'll pass it over to Janice.
Sure. Thank you, Vanessa. And it's an honor to be here today, and an honor to be on this panel with Antoine. And Antoine, I knew you were a Tom Longboat Award winner, so I'm especially excited about that. This conversation is really meaningful to me because my family too, comes from, survived the residential school system. My family being from the Fisher River and Peguis Cree Nation, with family, much further up north, and we were among the first families to settle in the south. And a lot of my family went to Brandon, and so that's partly what led me to the work that I do on sports and games and Indian residential schools. It merges my two parts, I guess, of who I am. One is a former athlete. And really trying to figure out the complexities of that coming up the system, being both in the mainstream and the Indigenous sports system, and also just trying to reconcile the diaspora, that my family has become, living off reserve, and having to integrate into the mainstream, and then, trying to find your way through that. I think for me, this kind of conversation is really important because we're 10 years out from the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, releasing its first suite of final reports. And I think, there have been a lot of people doing a lot of reflection and a lot of learning over the past 10 years. And we've come a long way, I think, we, especially Indigenous people and some allies, and residential school survivors too. And, they have, a lot of really important things to add to the conversation since the TRC. And so I think, these kinds of conversations aren't just a moment to reiterate, what the TRC said or the conversations that were happening in 2015, but to understand how they've changed and deepened, and how people are thinking about things now. Because, people reflect on what they've learned through different processes. Yeah, like Antoine said, we've all been through COVID. Hopefully we've all learned a lot about, ourselves, about what it means to be in community and what it means to be in Canada, and all of the different movements that have advanced our understanding of that. So I see these as really important opportunities to reflect on where we're at now. And that's why I think this conversation is so important.
Congrats, Janice. So, you mentioned the calls to action, right? And we're at the 10-year anniversary since the final report was released. We know that a number of calls to action were focused on sports and recreation. I'm curious about what you both think, in terms of how have these calls to action been taken up? Where are we in terms of sports and rec and reconciliation? And if it's okay, we'll start with you, Janice.
Sure. Well, there's 5 calls to action for sport in the TRC. And, in many ways, they are, in retrospect, assimilationist. I think at the time when the TRC came out, there certainly was celebration among many people in Indigenous sport and in the mainstream sport system too, highlighting the importance of sport in terms of reconciling the future for Indigenous settler relations in Canada. Because it was one of the first times where sport was given that kind of prominence, and not just kind of a backseat. I mean, we saw it in previous policy documents like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, but this was more fleshed out. But 10 years on, and if you look at those calls, it's really about inclusion. It's really about Indigenous people kind of finding their way into the sports system, and about the mainstream sports system making space for them. And I think, legislation, UNDRIP is now legislated in Canada. And that reminds us that it's not just about inclusion and, addressing the racism that is part of the mainstream sports system, because it's embedded in it. It's also about supporting Indigenous ways of knowing and being through their own sports. You take a look at Arctic sports, you take a look at, the way in which Indigenous people think of lacrosse, like the Haudenosaunee. You think of like all of the different ways that Indigenous people engage in their own types of physical culture, and that's very different than the mainstream. Like they're 2 different worldviews. They're working towards 2 different things, and I think it's important now, 10 years on, that we acknowledge that. So really, that the calls to action haven't progressed that far. It's in many ways, it's about the mainstream sports system pumping more money into a system to do more inclusion work, and that hasn't gone very far. And in fact, if you take a look the federal government website, in terms of what it thinks it's achieved for the TRC, it's really quite sad that we haven't gone that far. I think you'll find the most productive progress happening at the community level, where communities and nations are thinking deeply about how they want to, move forward with their own ideas about sport and recreation. So yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Miigwech. And for both of our speakers, we're just being asked if you wouldn't mind speaking a little closer to your microphone for our audience. That would be appreciated. And I'll pass it over to you, Antoine. What do you think about kind of the focus of sports and rec in terms of reconciliation?
Well, I would agree with Janice is that we haven't really progressed as far as we can, especially in the communities. My community of Fort Good Hope, there's only 600 people there. But one thing I know for sure is that our community will never do as well as we did before. One of my first cousins, Fred Kelly, he was in the Olympics in Japan 1972. And when we were talking about the Olympics coming up, he asked me if I was going to stay with the team to do that. And I told him, no, I think my education is more important. I want to finish high school. I want to study something that'll give me a job for lifetime, rather than just narrow it down to being a coach. And what happened to him was that he had a tragic end because the probably whoever is involved with sports is that at the level that you're training and if you're going to be a national uh, champion, it's way up here. But when you go back to your community, you have to deal with people on an everyday kind of level. The drop is too far for an ordinary person to live with, especially when you realize that the only position you're qualified for now for life is coaching. And the reason I also say is that we need more work on the community level, not just coming from policy or paper or federal legislative work or things like that. Is that my my grandfather Peter Mountain Senior? He told me just walk wherever you need to go. You need to exercise your legs. What he also said was your mother. Your mother needs to feel you close every day. He's talking about the earth. And as I'm walking around our small community, I notice that none of the young people are walking. They're all on four-wheelers or riding in a vehicle. You know, you look at the competition coming from places like Kenya. Those people, they run wherever they're going every single day. The only running we see these days is when an election comes up and the politicians want to see that wants you to see that they're wearing running shoes. And so one of the very beginnings for talking about something like this was, in my case, it was in one of the most notorious residential schools, Grolier Hall in Inuvik, had one of the highest number of court cases coming from supervisors that were pedophiles and sheltered by the clergy, which was running the institutions on behalf of the Canadian government. When we are talking about differences, let's say between Canada and the United States, we are far in advance of understanding things like residential schools compared to the boarding schools in the US. Nobody talks about the boarding schools in the US, and here, at least in Canada, we have taken some steps forward, but it hasn't all come from commissions or from our leadership. A good deal of it comes from the support that we don't even know we have amongst the average Canadian citizens. So I think for now that what Janice has to say about we need more evidence, we need more results from input into the communities. I mean, you can throw all the money you want at the situation, but it's not going to help the ordinary person that wants to do well from our smaller communities. So I'll just say that much for now. Merci, miigwech.
Miigwech for sharing that, Antoine. And maybe now is a good time to kind of stop and reflect on your achievements, both of you as athletes. I know our audience wants to take a good look, if you're willing to share, Antoine, at your medal that you're wearing, to just take a moment to look at it in the camera. And if you could speak about that experience and what does that mean, that sort of achievement for the ordinary person, for youth coming up, and similar, Janice, like what sorts of messages does this send in terms of inspiration and also your experience as a woman athlete? So I'll send it over to Antoine first. Thanks.
I'll try to do this without hanging myself here. It's the original Tom Longboat Award.
Mm.
And when the subject comes up of deniers, denialism, this is something that I can personally show to people that want to rewrite history, want to ignore whatever parts that are brown or black in our country that makes a powerful statement. In the words of my grandfather, Peter Mountain Sr., what he always told me was, wenda si. Say lani dwenech ara riratidishu. Neniazon bakalain nata. What he's saying is, well, at first I thought he was talking about it only taking 2.5 minutes to make microwave popcorn. But I realized that he had a lot more to say, that what he was talking about is if you have a dream, if you have a vision, you have to work on it every single day to make that dream or that vision come true for yourself. Once it comes true in your life, no one can ever take it from you because you're the only one that worked on it. And having a dream or a vision, it's always something that, let's say these days, you see somebody else doing all those things on TV. It always seems to be slightly out of reach until you take that first step towards it. And one of those for myself was, even though that one residential school that I started cross-country skiing in, the average day in winter would be 30, 40 below, I still wanted to be on the team. So when myself and my best friend John Cellier joined in, they didn't have any equipment for us. We just used old army skis that were tied on with rope and hockey sticks for poles. You always have to start somewhere. My part of it was I wanted to be physically out of the residential school for at least maybe 2 or 3 hours every day, even though it was pitch dark and they had lights strung up on the course that we went back and forth on. It didn't matter to me. I wanted to be out of there so that I could think for myself. And a good part of all these achievements that you're talking about. Myself, I have a doctorate now from Trent University that I got last June. An A average student, no less. And that's another thing that my lifetime coach, my grandfather, Peter Mountain Sr., he told me, you do something, you do it better than anybody else. Don't come in second. He said, you don't need to do that. If you're going to do something, you do it as well as you can. I'll also tell a funny story before I hand it off again to Janice. is that cleanliness was one of the main things that our mother always taught us. She always talked about she says, don't live a messy life. Even my grandfather, he said that the way it is around you is the way it is in your mind. And that's where everything starts from. So one of the preliminary awards that I was given was the Best Cleanup Boy Award. That is for being so neat and tiny around, cleaning up all around the residential schools and stuff. And then they gave me an award. It was about a foot tall. It was of a statue of a man standing there looking up to the heavens. That was the award. So when I brought it back home, my grandmother thought so much about it that she put it in the prize place on top of the cupboard in our home. And then one day, one of my younger sisters, Lucianne, we were taught to stay out of the way if elders were coming around. We went upstairs and to stay quiet up there. She was looking down the stairs at grandma's group of visitors, and she called me over and she said, "You won't believe this, brother, what they're doing with your award." So my grandma had visitors, all of her friends. They had set up their chairs all around in the circle. Right in the middle of the circle was my Best Cleanup Boy Award, the man standing with his hand up to the heavens. And they were all praying to it. They thought it was a religious statue of some kind. We were taught not to laugh at our elders, so we really had to keep quiet up there. I'll just throw that in for the time being. Asi Miigwech.
That's a good story. Miigwech, Antoine, and over to you, Janice.
Yeah, I mean, many years ago, I used to be a competitive distance runner at the varsity level and also a badminton player. And, you know, sport was differently complicated for me as an Indigenous woman coming up through the system, being displaced and, you know, and trying to find your identity in the context of that. And, you know, it was interesting because you know, I too had embraced some of the stereotypes about Indigenous physicality, you know, thinking that Indigenous people were naturally like good long distance runners. And I couldn't figure out why it took me so much work, you know, in order to be a mediocre runner, you know, in high school. And then I had to work really hard in university to be competitive at the national level. And other people seemed to come by it more naturally, which they probably did biologically. And then you layer, you know, being an Indigenous woman on top of that, you know, at one level, you know, as I started to become aware of the violence associated with being Indigenous and female, being more worried about running at night, or even on my own, growing up in Northern Ontario and, you know, and then in London, Ontario. And, you know, it wasn't always safe. And then also just, you know, having to respond to people's questions. And I don't think they meant to be racist, but they were racist questions just about being Indigenous female and being an athlete. And I didn't have the language for it then, right? And so I think I just ended up retreating into myself, where sometimes I would respond with anger, and that wasn't really a good place to be. So, you know, it was all of those early experiences that were really formative, you know, in my thinking. And that led me down this path to try and explore, you know, the meaning of sport and Indigenous lives and what they were trying to achieve through it. And, you know, connecting with other, you know, Indigenous athletes who were at the varsity level and struggling, you know, in their own way with similar questions, but also different. And I think, you know, Antoine talks about the importance of being on the land and how, you know, our culture and our identities are connected to land. And I think for me, that's a really important thread that that's become more important in my work and in the conversations that I have, because there's this idea that sport is somehow naturally positive, that there's this real toxic positivity to sport. at least at the level that I work at the provincial and national level. And, you know, you often hear about it as like the only good thing, you know, that happens in sport. And that's sort of the narrative that gets layered on to residential school experiences, especially when they come from, you know, a sport background there. And, you know, and residential school survivors are trying to explain their stories more fully. And people who don't understand just think, well, sport was a good thing, you know, and it, you know, like as if it sort of absolved, you know, what happened like at school. And in that way, sport becomes part of the, sport is a denialist narrative in that sense. And it's really hard for people to speak back to it because they, you know, they had experiences through sport, the residential school survivors, you know, but they're really, really complicated. And most people don't understand that. So we have to understand these residential school experiences and even the experiences in community in the context of colonialism. And in that way, you know, that toxic positivity should be pushed to the sidelines so that we can understand what is happening in community more and what survivors are saying. You know, and I go back to, you know, Antoine's point about, you know, knowing your language and knowing your culture and knowing the land, like that gets erased when you start talking about organized sport. Part of the work that I did a number of years ago was on interviews with Tom Longboat Award winners. And, you know, especially the people from the 1950s and the 1960s and the ones who were still really rooted in their culture, they talked about that, you know, about how you can't let sport and its assimilationist objectives, you know, override the need to know your language and your culture and who you are. You have to know where you come from. And, you know, it's hard for the younger generation coming up through the pipe, especially the ones who are part of the diaspora like me, where they're using sport to find their identity, to be accepted into an Indigenous community, to be acknowledged as Indigenous, but they don't know their language, they don't know the culture, and they don't really know where they come from. And so I think, you know, that's one of the things that I've, you know, seen coming up through the pipe and that I've taken away through my experiences. So it's really not so much about me anymore and my story. It's really about, you know, trying to understand where the new generation is coming from and what the older generation is still trying to say. Because it's those two kind of different worlds that really need to meet up somehow. Because right now they're kind of like in a siloed kind of track, but they need to enter into conversation with each other so that we can make sport better. We can make it work better for the nations and the communities and the people of the diaspora, and we can make sport better in the mainstream.
So much to think about there, Janice, and a really great transition into thinking about tradition, culture, and sport. So I'm from a community, Six Nations, where lacrosse is really big here. It's called the Creators Game. So it's rooted in our origin stories. We're seeing more girls enter the sport of lacrosse increasingly, but lacrosse is the game here. And it's very much connected to a sense of tradition. I wonder if you both could reflect a little bit on this. Often, as Janice has pointed out, with this sort of assimilationist logic, sport is siloed or separate from culture. And indeed, that's what residential schools were trying to do, right? To separate culture out of everything, actually. So, can you talk a little bit about the importance of culture and tradition in sport, either from the perspective of traditional forms of sport in our communities or how they play a role now in whatever sport we're playing? I'll start with Janice and we'll move on to Antoine.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm really excited to hear what Antoine has to say. I think my contribution to this dialogue is that uh, you know, organized sport in the mainstream system is, you know, what I like to call a form of placeless education. And I got that from an article called Learning Like Before. You can maybe find it online. But it's this idea that it displaces people from the land and from the culture that is rooted in the land there, right, from in that territory. So it can also include the water. I'm, you know, in British Columbia now, and there's a lot of water here. And so, you know, as a form of placeless education, is just it allows people to kind of embrace the values of organized sport, which is really about, competitive individualism, even if you're on a team. It's typically about individual awards with MVPs and statistics and all of the different ways that, that kind of competition privileges those values. And, what I see happening in community when when I'm doing that kind of work is they have a very different sense, of what sport is used for. And it's usually about trying to rebuild, connections to community, into culture, into territory. And it's not to say that you can't have competitive aspirations for that, because they can coexist. I think people are really doing that work. Like, the lacrosse example that you talk about is an obvious one, especially when it's rooted in community, or in the nation. And also I think about, Arctic sports up north. That too, is another good example. But it's very different. That is a place-based kind of, or culture-based, or identity-based, nation-based form of education. And it's so different. And so I think, it's really important to keep in mind that this organized sports system is not set up to do that kind of place-based learning, to do that kind of culture-based learning. And people really struggle like with how to do that. So for me, I think the most meaningful interventions, the most meaningful and important work is being done at the community level. And that's why it's important to advocate for more resources, more supports, from different sources to allow people to do that, to build those intergenerational connections through sport and physical activity, which it wasn't so long ago where we did that, right? I mean, Antoine was talking about it. So yeah, I'd like to hear from Antoine too, though.
Absolutely. So over to you, Antoine. You can culture, tradition, sport, take it away.
Well, one interesting note about being an athlete at that time, which probably doesn't happen a lot anymore. For instance, in basketball, we had nicknames for each other. Mine was Doctor of the Dunk because I like to play on a higher elevation. But these days, when I step on a basketball court, they call me Dunkin' Donuts. Anyway, it's good to have that. I had a grandfather by the name of Tloga. It means laughter. That was his name. And I guess people knew him because he had a very jolly kind of attitude. And the reason I'm mentioning those is that there really doesn't have to be that kind of a fatalistic or negative connotation between sports and culture. In our Dene way, there's no real division, and in fact, in all of indigenous ways of knowing, the the medicine wheel teaches us that parts of the wheel involving different types of, let's say, forms of existence or understanding are actually interchangeable. I'll give you an example of why it doesn't have to be so fatalistic or negative. Is I spent a lot of time over the years visiting our relatives, the Navajo and Apache in Arizona and New Mexico. And one of the things that happened with the boarding school in Tuba City, Arizona, which is the in the western division of the Navajo Nation, at Gray Hills High School, the basketball team was doing so well that the coaches were encouraged to send their athletes, the entire team, to learn about their Navajo Dene traditional ways of doing things. So they brought them into the place they called the office, which is the sweat lodge, tache. They brought them in there and they got to think as a team, to work as a team. And that touches on what we like to call resiliency amongst our indigenous people. How would it be possible for us to be on this in this part of the world for 35,000 years without that, having that kind of resiliency already written into our traditions. Also, the fact of ethics. We need to have permission in order to do things of a spiritual nature in somebody else's territory. That's already written into our traditional ways of doing things. Another example is the LA Lakers, the basketball team. They had a coach by the name of Phil Jackson. What he wanted to do was introduce indigenous ways into their training regimen. So he got them to find out what all of their sacred items were about: tobacco, cedar, sage, sweetgrass, how we use those and what purpose those have. They had a dynasty, no less, of 11 years, championships, LA Lakers. These are facts that point to arguments that people might say, well, there's too much a division between sports and culture. That cannot be true. When you look at even music, for instance, why is it that Black people have the best music in the world? That's because it's part of their being. With us, it has to do with sports, also the arts, you know. We're so close to nature that we can't help but being the best of renderers of any kind of physical imagery. We already have a step forward. What can happen to step beyond this kind of fatalism, negativity, is that we have to think that as individual athletes, as individual members of the indigenous community, we have to put all of that colonialist thinking behind. When you're running, let's say long distance, for instance, you have to put it in your mind from start to finish that you are going to do the best that you can. And if possible, you'll be stepping to the podium later. That is, if you have any energy left. So these are the kind of things that are good to keep in mind, that there's no way that you can lose when you really start thinking about yourself as being somebody that can represent your particular area or your particular people in a meaningful way. And our people, amongst our people, they expect as much. What my grandfather, Peter Mountain Sr., told me is, every time you leave your place, every time you step out of your door, you're representing your people. You have to be mindful of that. Try to keep up with your language, understand what where your elders are coming from, and then you'll have a very good chance of doing well on behalf of your people. Merci, miigwech.
Miigwech, what an inspiring message. And I think a great way maybe to open it up, because I know our audience is really enjoying the conversation and they have questions. I still have a couple of more, but I'm going to put them on hold and open it up. So our first question coming in is a question about land acknowledgements at sporting events. So really great question. So would you like to hear land acknowledgements at sporting events? Is this performative allyship, or is this one way to contribute to reconciliation? So I'll hand it over to Janice first.
Yeah, for me, it's if it's not matched with actually systemic change, it's performative. I mean, at this point in time, we're 10 years beyond the TRC. And if that's where we're still at, is with these symbolic gestures, especially with sporting events that are, you know, run by private corporations or people with a lot of money, or even some, like, you know, national sport organizations have a lot of money or access to pots of money, and they can change the system. They can use their political power in order to make change. So if there's nothing that backs it up now with systemic change, it's really performative. And so I tend not to go to sporting events because I do find them quite just, you know, psychologically violent, and just in terms of the values and, you know, and what it is that they're trying to achieve. And also I find them still very kind of, you know, colonial, if you will. just is the organized sport, just to come back to a point that Antoine made, about culture being inseparable from sport. Like what the mainstream sport system doesn't understand that it's advocating and it's promoting a particular type of culture too. It just doesn't acknowledge that. And, what it doesn't want is indigenous culture, unless it augments the mainstream system, in which case, that's the settler colonial containment, where it contains indigenous culture and it just picks up elements that make it better, that make it look better, that make the mainstream system look better. And land acknowledgements is one of those. And so I would hope that 10 years on past the TRC, now that we can do a heck of a lot better than that.
Thanks, Janice. And what do you think, Antoine?
Well, the basic premise I see is what we are talking about here with land acknowledgement has to do with identity. I'll give you an example of my research. I didn't only go into our particular mountain Dene way of acknowledging those that have passed on. I also studied cancer in the north in our community. Out of a small community, we lost 45 people from cancer, probably from the water, probably from the water coming from ESSO building 5 facilities up the river from us. We noticed a change in the fish were not as firm as before, and people started dying of cancer until we changed our water source. And but this matter of identity, one of the areas I did some research on was the Apache. How they recognize all places from the people that live there. What their point is that when you're going out to somebody else's country, even on your own tribal lands, you're going to meet specific spirits that'll interact with what you're doing there. And in terms of acknowledging individual tribal affiliations to where sports facilities are, it's a necessary acknowledgement. It's part of our medicine wheel. It's part of our ways of doing things. We do things one step at a time, and then when you get done with it, you incorporate whatever that event was into your being. And as far as changing things like corporations, that's not really very hard to do at all. When you think about Jimmy Kimmel and Disney lost $4.3 billion in one day for what happened to the comedian Jimmy Kimmel. That's no laughing matter, and it's a matter of comedy too. So anything that we see as an obstacle, yes, it's taken us 10 years to get here, but at least we are here. We are not where we were 10 years ago. We have a lot more support amongst Canadians than Americans have, even with their own neighbors. It's all a starting point as far as even sports, culture, the arts. You have to start somewhere. You can't just start thinking that it's going to be turning the other way because a large corporation has to say so. I mean, I've never seen a dollar bill win a sporting event. It's a human condition that we have created and we can acknowledge and revise. Merci, miigwech.
Miigwech. So we have another question coming in, and it's about tokenism in sport. So I'll read the question. A bit of background first. I was watching the International World Athletics Championships and noticed that there were no Indigenous athletes at all. As an Inuk millennial woman that grew up between my homeland in Inuit Nunangat and Treaty 1 in the south, I found it incredibly hard to be accepted into any type of sports. I was pushed out of diving or swimming, also badminton and squash, and finally softball. It became necessary to quit because I didn't have the strength that I have now to push forward. My children are Generation Zs and were raised mostly in Inuit Nunangat, where they became active and successful in sport. But when in the South, it was so different to see the quote inclusion they received. I found it was more of a tokenism. So the question is there a way to change this? We need to change it to make our inclusion be for success rather than for tokenism. Who would like to comment first?
Well, I have one thing to say about that tokenism, the racism that I went through in my earlier years. They're largely exchanged, let's say, for something more palatable today. At the time that I won my Tom Longboat Award, I didn't even know it existed. I was running the mile in 4 minutes and 7 seconds without knowing that there was any kind of other way, let's say, to go about it or do it. The award was given to me by the vice principal of our high school in the hallway. If I was a white student, there would have been a general assembly with music and everything like that to go with it. In a way, you have to take yourself as an Indigenous person out of the tokenist situation. In other words, according to our Indigenous people, you have to challenge yourself every single day, every single way, in order to improve yourself as a viable member of our Indigenous community. That means that there has to be people that are ready to challenge, let's say, the sports world individually, and we have a lot of good examples, even lately. Graham Greene, one of the top actors. And one other example I will give you is the Gordon Tatusis, for instance. When he was asked about why he chose to live at his on his reserve at Poundmakers in Saskatchewan and not in Hollywood amongst all the other top Hollywood actors, his answer was he has everything he needs right at home. What he's trying to say is that, let's say, as an athlete, you already have all you need. You don't only have the talent, you have that deep-rooted rhythmical connection to your Mother Earth that's going to propel you forward. This is one of the ways that Indigenous culture works into it. Jim Thorpe himself, as a runner, he thought of himself as one of his tribal teachings as being pushed by the earth itself when he was doing his running. These are the kinds of tie-ins, let's say, you have with your culture that make it possible to get beyond this tokenism and denialism. Merci, miigwech.
Miigwech. And final words from Janice on this topic.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about advocacy kind of work. It kind of bridges the research that I do and the nonprofit work that I do. And so these kind of questions really get me fired up. Without knowing the context of, the experience, I think, there's a number of things that can be done because I do believe change can happen. I mean, I have seen change like over the last 25 years. And one is, for the people who are experiencing these things to learn to develop their voice and tell their story in a way that that makes sense. And that's really hard to do. That is so much easier said than done. But it really is important that people speak out and be given platforms to speak out and tell their stories, because it very rarely happens in sport. I mean, think of all of the news articles where we actually hear from Indigenous athletes who speak about the racism that they experience. I mean, there's often just very extraordinary examples that percolate to the surface, but we know so much more about women in sport, for instance, about their experiences, and they've been really able to move, the gender issue along, like women in sport issue along. So I think people need to be able to develop their stories, craft their stories, and tell them in a way that really resonates. And I think the space that I work in is often with the system, the quote unquote, the system. And man, there is so much work that needs to be done. They need to be educated on colonialism and settler colonialism. They know they use the words all the time, but they have no clue like what it means or what it looks like. And I think there's a willingness to learn. I wouldn't be here if there wasn't, I don't think. But they have no clue. And so, there's very few people like myself who are actually doing that kind of systemic change, and who are doing like a really good job of it. Like other people go in sometimes and they give a light understanding of colonialism, but we really need these nuanced stories in order to help people understand what it looks like in the context of their national sport organizations, the provincial sport organizations, within the government. So how do you change the funding so we make this work? How do we change like the rules for participation, so things can be better? Like, how do we put in supports, when supports are needed, and not just, denigrated or tokenized, or held over the heads of the athletes when they actually do need support? Like, we need to create systemic change that actually creates these avenues that allow athletes to flourish. Because people have been talking about this for decades. Indigenous athletes have been talking about it really since like the 1950s, maybe probably earlier, but since the 1950s, since 1951, since the Tom Longboat Awards were created, and then all through the system. And so here we are, 50, 75 years later, and still, it's really such a struggle. So develop voice, change the system, get in the system, make that change.
Beautiful. Miigwech to you both. I'm going to hand it over to Sandra now to close us off.
So thank you so much to all three of you for this incredible conversation. We've had more questions than we have time to give answers to. But again, if anyone's question didn't get answered and you're burning for an answer, please do reach out to us. Thanks so much for joining us. I will share that all of these videos will be available on our YouTube page, and that goes for every other Lunch and Learn this week. So we do hope to see you at those. Please, I know that these topics do stir up incredibly painful and traumatic feelings, particularly for those of us who've been directly impacted by this. But vicarious trauma is also a real medical thing. So if you are in need of support, we did share some resources in the chat. So yeah, please do avail yourselves of those if you need. Hopefully we'll see a lot of you back here tomorrow at the same time. Massive thanks to our speakers. Antoine, I'm only ever going to call you Dr. Dunk from here on in, so I hope you're prepared for that. So thanks to all of you, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.